I'm sure most, if not every single one of you, have heard of the incredibly popular and famous show, Game of Thrones. What many of you may not know, however, is that that show is actually heavily inspired by real-life events in English history. A civil war that caused the deaths of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, and lasted over 30 years, leaving almost no part of England untouched. I'm, of course, talking about the brutal Wars of the Roses. There were many causes of the Wars of the Roses, but the main one was ultimately the succession crisis following the death of Edward III in 1377. Although Edward's succession initially seemed secure, there was a sudden narrowing of the direct line of descent near the end of his reign. Edward's two eldest sons, Edward, Duke of Cornwall, also known as Edward the Black Prince, the heir presumptive, and Lionel, Duke of Clarence, had both died before their father in 1376 and 1368 respectively. Edward III was survived by three sons with claims to the throne: John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, Edmund of Langley, and Thomas of Woodstock. The two main factions that would form and end up fighting for the throne in the Wars of the Roses are the descendants of two of these sons. The House of Lancaster descended from John of Gaunt, the third and eldest surviving son of Edward III. The Lancastrian claim on the throne had received preference from Edward III, who explicitly emphasised the male line of descent, which would become important later on. An important branch of the House of Lancaster was the House of Beaufort, whose members were descended from John of Gaunt by his mistress, Catherine Swynford. Originally illegitimate, they were legitimised by an Act of Parliament when Gaunt and Catherine later married. The House of York, on the other hand, descended from Edmund of Langley, the fourth son of Edward III and the younger brother of John of Gaunt. The Yorkist claim to the throne, however, unlike the Lancastrian one, was based upon the female line of descent as descendants of Lionel, the Duke of Clarence, Edward III's second eldest son and older brother of John of Gaunt, who had passed away prior to his father's death. But anyways, with that explanation of the factions out of the way, let's get back to the succession crisis. To complicate matters further than they already were following the death of Edward III, the Black Prince, his eldest son, who had died at this point, had a son Richard, who had a very solid claim to the throne, based upon the principle that the son of an elder brother had priority in the line of succession over his uncles, most notably John of Gaunt and Edmund of Langley. However, as Richard was a minor, being only 10 years old at the time, had no siblings, as well as having 3 living uncles at the time of the king's death, there was considerable uncertainty within the realm over who should inherit the throne. Ultimately, Edward III was succeeded by his grandson, who was crowned Richard II, still being just 10 years old. During Richard's first years as king, the government was in the hands of a series of regency councils due to his young age, which were primarily influenced by his uncles John of Gaunt and Thomas of Woodstock. To make the situation more difficult for the young monarch, England faced various problems, most notably the 100 Years' War during this period. Another major challenge which soon arose, however, was the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, which the young king would ultimately play a vital role in ending. Less warlike than either his father or grandfather, Richard then sought to bring an end to the 100 Years' War. A firm believer in the royal prerogative, Richard restrained the power of the aristocracy and relied on a private retinue for military protection instead. In contrast to his grandfather, Edward III, Richard cultivated a refined atmosphere centered on art and culture at court, in which he, the king, was an elevated figure. It is believed that Richard II was the first king of England to demand that he be referred to as Your Majesty or Your Highness, with the kings prior to that being content with being referred to as My Lord. In spite of his efforts to resolve the issues I had previously mentioned, his reign was still quite tumultuous, marked by increasing dissension between the monarch and several of the most powerful nobles. The king's dependence on a small number of courtiers, which was aiming to diminish the power of the nobles, caused discontent among the influential, and in 1387 control of the government was taken over by a group of nobles known as the Lords Appellant. By 1389, the now 22-year-old Richard had regained control and for the next 8 years ruled in relative harmony with his former opponents. In France, much of the territory conquered by Edward III was lost under his reign, which led Richard to negotiate a peace treaty known as the Truce of Lullingham with Charles VI of France in July 1389. The peace proposal, which would have effectively made England a client kingdom of France, was predictably rejected by Parliament, which was predominantly controlled by the knights fighting the war. In response to this, Richard decided to negotiate a de facto peace directly with Charles without seeking Parliament's approval, where he agreed to marry Charles' 6-year-old daughter. Richard then used this interim peace to punish his political rivals, and in 1397 he took his revenge on the Appellants, who had previously dethroned him by executing or exiling those responsible. The next 2 years have been described by historians as Richard's tyranny, a tyranny which would ultimately prove to be his downfall. When John of Gaunt died in 1399, 2 years into this tyranny, Richard exiled Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, to France and confiscated all his lands and titles. Henry Bolingbroke wouldn't stay content in France for long, however, as when Richard left England in May 1399 for a military expedition in Ireland, Bolingbroke returned to England with an army and invaded the country in June 1399 to little resistance. With the support of much of the disaffected nobility, Bolingbroke deposed Richard and was crowned as Henry IV, the first Lancastrian monarch. Following the ascension of Henry, Richard is thought to have been starved to death in captivity, although questions remain regarding his final fate. Richard's posthumous reputation has been shaped to a large extent by William Shakespeare, whose play, Richard II, portrayed Richard's misrule and his deposition as responsible for the Wars of the Roses. Modern historians do not accept this interpretation, however, while still not downplaying his role in his own deposition. Modern historians believe that while probably not insane, as many historians of the 19th and 20th centuries believed, he may have had a personality disorder such as psychopathy, sociopathy, or narcissistic personality disorder, which particularly manifested itself towards the end of his reign. Most authorities agree that his policies were not unrealistic or even entirely unprecedented, but that the way in which he carried them out was unacceptable to the political establishment, leading to his downfall. Almost immediately after assuming the throne, Henry IV faced an attempted deposition known as the Epiphany Rising in 1400 by John Montagu, John Holland, Thomas Holland, and Thomas Despenser, all powerful nobles who attempted to reinstall the imprisoned Richard as king. The attempt failed, however, with all 4 conspirators being executed and Richard dying shortly after. Further west in Wales, the Welsh, who had generally supported Richard's rule, launched a rebellion following the ascension of Henry, led by Owain Glyndwr, a member of the Welsh nobility. Glyndwr's rebellion would last quite some time, outlasting the reign of Henry, and would not end until 15 years later, in 1415. During the revolt, Glyndwr, by the way, if I'm mispronouncing that, someone please correct me in the comments, received aid from members of the Tudors, who you may recognise the name of, who were a prominent Anglesey family in Wales and maternal cousins to Glyndwr himself, and would ultimately come to play a defining role in the coming Wars of the Roses. Henry IV would die in 1413 after years of quite serious illness, including a disfiguring skin disease, but more seriously, acute attacks of grave illness, which he would suffer 5 times in the 8 years leading up to his death, before his final, fatal one in March 1413. Henry IV was succeeded to the throne by his legendary son, Henry of Monmouth, who was crowned as Henry V. And yes, I am well aware of how many Henrys there were around this time, which does make it rather confusing, especially considering that this Henry I'm talking about now also named his son and successor Henry, but please just bear with me for a bit. Some of my more loyal viewers will know that I've already made individual videos on both this Henry, Henry V, as well as his crazy son who would succeed him, so I will keep their inclusions in this video brief and only associated to the Wars of the Roses, but we'll put a link to those individual videos in the description and at the end screen of this video. Anyways, in relation to the Wars of the Roses, Henry V faced many less rebellions and had a much more peaceful reign than his father. There was one standout, however. The Southampton plot, as it would come to be known, was a major challenge to Henry V's authority, led by Sir Thomas Grey, Henry Ballinscope, and Richard of Conisbrough, who, importantly to this video, was the second son of Edmund of Langley, the first Duke and founder of House York. The conspirators intended to replace Henry with the young Edmund Mortimer, who was Richard of Conisbrough's maternal uncle, and the heir presumptive to Richard II, as he was also a great-great-grandson of Edward III. Mortimer, however, remained loyal and informed Henry of the plot partially led by his nephew, with all 3 of the ringleaders subsequently being executed. After this plot had been put to rest, Henry embarked on his legendary campaign in France, marked by many great victories, which firmly entrenched both the legitimacy of the Lancastrian monarchy, as well as Henry's pursuit of the French throne. While he achieved many great victories in France, these were not without losses amongst the nobility, as, following the Battle of Agincourt, the 4-year-old son of Richard of Conisbrough, who had just been executed for his role in the Southampton plot, was left to inherit the Yorkist claims and power following the death of his paternal uncle Edward, 2nd Duke of York, in the battle. When Edmund Mortimer died childless in 1425, Richard of York, who was now 15, also inherited the earldom of March and Mortimer's claim to the throne through his late mother, Edmund Mortimer's sister. It seems possible that Henry only allowed the son of a man executed for conspiring against him to inherit such power and claims, because he did not doubt the security of the Lancastrian crown at this time, as he had 3 younger brothers himself and had recently married Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the French king, who soon gave birth to a son, also named Henry, on the 6th of December 1421. This security for the Lancastrians would all come crashing down, however, when Henry V died of dysentery at the young age of 35 in France, leaving his 9-month-old son to ascend to the throne. To make matters worse for the Lancastrians, Henry V's younger brothers produced no surviving legitimate heirs, leaving only the Beaufort family, who, if you recall, were a branch of the Lancastrians started by legitimised bastards, as alternative Lancastrian successors. As Richard of York grew into maturity and the child Henry VI rule deteriorated, the Yorkist claim to the throne only became more attractive. On top of this, the revenue from his estates made Richard the wealthiest man in the kingdom. From early childhood, Henry VI was surrounded by quarrelsome counsellors and advisors, including his younger surviving paternal uncle, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who sought to be named Lord Protector until Henry came of age, and deliberately courted the popularity of the common people for his own ends. He was opposed in his pursuits by his half-uncle, Cardinal Henry Beaufort, yet another Henry, who on several occasions called on John, Duke of Bedford, Gloucester's older brother and nominal regent to Henry, to return from his post as the king's commander in France, to either mediate or defend him against Humphrey's accusations of treason. Back in France, the French at this time had rallied around Joan of Arc and had inflicted major defeats on the English at Orleans and Patay, reversing many of the gains made by Henry V. Around this time as well, the current King Henry's mother, Catherine of Valois, had remarried Owen Tudor and bore 2 surviving sons, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, both of whom would play key roles in the concluding stages of the coming wars. The young Henry finally came of age in 1437 at age 16. However, Bedford, his old friend, had died 2 years earlier, and as a result, Cardinal Henry Beaufort largely withdrew himself from public affairs, likely partially because of the rise to prominence of his ally William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, as the dominant personality in the royal court. Like Beaufort, Suffolk favoured a diplomatic rather than a military solution to the deteriorating situation in France, a position which resonated with Henry, who was by nature averse to violence and bloodshed. Suffolk was opposed by Gloucester and the rising Richard of York, both of whom favoured a continued military solution against France. Suffolk and the Beaufort family frequently received large grants of money, land, and important government and military positions from the king, who preferred their less hawkish inclinations, redirecting much-needed resources away from Richard and Gloucester's ongoing campaigns in France, which only increased tensions and resulted in Richard developing a bitter resentment for the Beauforts. Suffolk continued to increase his influence at court and was the principal architect of the Treaty of Troyes in 1444, which brokered what would ultimately only be a temporary peace between England and France. Though Suffolk earned a promotion from Earl to Marquis, and later Duke for his efforts, the clauses of the treaty that required cession of lands to France were kept secret from the English public due to fears of a significant backlash. 2 years later, in 1447, Suffolk succeeded in having Gloucester arrested for treason, with Gloucester ultimately dying while awaiting trial, with many at the time suspecting Suffolk had him poisoned. Possibly in fear of retaliation, Richard of York was then stripped of his prestigious command in France and sent to govern the relatively distant Lordship of Ireland, with a 10-year term of office where he could not interfere with affairs at court. During this time, England continued to suffer reversals in France, with Suffolk, who was now the principal power behind the throne, being unable to avoid taking the blame for these losses. Additionally, the blame of the unfavourable request to cede Maine and Anjou to the French was laid at Suffolk's feet, though he continued to insist he made no promises during negotiations to such a demand. In 1450, Suffolk was arrested, imprisoned in the Tower of London, and impeached in the Commons. Henry intervened, however, and instead exiled Suffolk for 5 years, but en route to Calais, Suffolk was then captured and executed on the 2nd of May, 1450. Suffolk was succeeded by Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, nephew of the Henry Beaufort mentioned earlier, as the leader of the faction pursuing peace with France. Somerset's political position was somewhat fragile, as military failures in 1449, following a resumption of hostilities, left him vulnerable to criticism from Richard's allies at court. To make matters worse for the king and his allies, Somerset had by this time become a close ally to King Henry's wife, Margaret of Anjou, who essentially controlled the weak king. A relationship so close that many suspected the two were having an affair, which caused issues upon the birth of Henry and Margaret's son, Edward, in 1454, as there were widespread rumours that Somerset was the real father. On the 15th of April 1450, the English suffered a major defeat in France at Formigny, which paved the way for the French reconquest of Normandy, the most important French region to the English crown. That same year, there was a violent popular uprising in Kent, which is often seen as a precursor to the Wars of the Roses. The rebel manifesto, named The Complaint of the Poor Commons of Kent, written under the stewardship of rebel leader Jake Cade, accused the crown of extortion, perversion of justice, and election fraud. The rebels occupied parts of London and executed James Fiennes, the unpopular Lord High Treasurer. They would ultimately disperse after they were supposedly pardoned though. This pardon wouldn't apply to the ringleaders however, as several of them, including Cade, were executed. After the rebellion, the grievances of Cade and his followers formed the basis of Richard of York's opposition to a royal government from which he felt unduly excluded. Richard of York used this rebellion as an opportunity to return from Ireland and went to London, angling himself as a reformer to demand better government. He would ultimately end up getting himself imprisoned however for much of 1452 and 1453. Throughout pretty much all these issues, the actual King Henry himself had taken little part in the proceedings. During his younger years, he displayed several symptoms of mental illness, and his near total lack of leadership in military matters is what had left the English forces in France so scattered and weak to begin with. Henry was described as more interested in matters of religion and learning, which, coupled with his timid and passive nature and if not well-intentioned aversion to warfare, made him an ineffective king for the time. His weak rule would lead to the English forces in southern France's catastrophic defeat at Castillon on the 17th of July 1453. This defeat meant that England had lost all possessions in France with the exception of the Pale of Calais and ended the 100 Years' War. Likely in reaction to this, Henry suffered a complete mental breakdown lasting over a year, which he failed to recognise the birth of his newborn son and was described as a sudden and accidental fright into such a weak state of health that for a whole year and a half he had neither sense nor reason capable of carrying on the government, and neither physician nor medicine could cure that infirmity. He was also described as smitten with a frenzy, and his wit and reason withdrawn during this period. Richard of York would not hesitate to leap on this opportunity, and gained a very important ally, Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick, one of the most influential magnates and possibly richer than York himself during this time. York would ultimately be named a regent as protector of the realm in 1454, with the Queen being entirely excluded in an attempt to prevent civil war. During his time as regent, York, fueled by his hatred for the Beaufort family, removed Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, from his position and imprisoned him in the Tower of London. All would not go to plan for York though, as in 1455 Henry made a surprise recovery from his mental instability and reversed much of Richard's progress. Somerset was then released and restored to favour, with York being forced out of court and into exile. However, disaffected nobles, chiefly the Earl of Warwick previously mentioned, and his father, the Earl of Salisbury, backed the claims of the rival House of York to control the government. King Henry, Somerset, and a select council of nobles elected to hold a great council at Leicester on the 22nd of May as a result, away from Somerset's enemies in London. Fearing that charges of treason would be brought against them, York and his allies gathered an army to intercept the royal party at St. Albans before they could reach the council. Well, I think that is where I'm going to end part 1, as this is the point where all the fighting truly begins. I'll try to get part 2 out at some point next week, though I will likely have a video coming out between these two parts, but we will see. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos from me. But with all that being said, as always, I hope you guys have a great day, night, wherever you are, and I hope to see you in the next one.